Sure, many years ago, Princess Diana fought a long battle against mines and the sort of eternal damage and risk they pose. Now we've got the US allowing mines to be used on behalf of Ukraine in the war with Putin and Russia. What the hell's going on?
It's been an interesting event in outcome this week. I mean, what's interesting is we're 1,000 days into the war, and it's only now that the US has chosen to send anti-personnel mines. They've been running anti-tank mines since the start of the war. They've been very effective at taking out Russian tanks, but anti-personnel mines, they're incredibly emotive. There's lots of international legislation trying to sort of limit their use, limit their and why is that? It's because every year, because these mines are put down, unless you collect them all up again afterwards, they remain active, often for decades. And therefore, some of them are quite small. You know, originally mines were designed to kill people. Then they worked out, actually, if you made it smaller charge and you simply maim people, their colleagues, it has more of an impact on an army's morale than just by killing people. And so they're quite small. It's quite small. Kids go and pick them up. And I think last year, there were over 5,000 people injured by landmines around the world, largely civilians, over 1,000 deaths. I mean, it was nearly 2,000 civilian deaths, and about 37% tragically of those are children who pick these things up. So, and the Russian mines are not untypical anti-personnel mines. They are mechanically operated. They should self-destruct after 40 hours, but typically a lot of that doesn't work, so they stay active for generations.
They deactivate themselves?
No, they literally explode. They explode.
Okay.
So they self-destruct.
And the mines that we're now allowing to be used, what do they do?
Right. The difference is that the American mines are electrically activated. So when you step on a mine, a conventional mine, it's a bit like if you pull the trigger of a gun, the mechanical lever hits the bullet, that percussion sets off the round. With a Russian mines, it's literally a mechanical action.
Interface.
Yeah. Whereas the American mines have got a circuit. So you make a circuit when you tread on the thing. That relies on a battery. The battery drains, and over between 1 and 40 hours, they can set how long these mines are going to be active for. But the default setting is inevitably the battery drains. And therefore, once it's drained, those mines are now harmless. They can't be activated. So the Americans claim that therefore they are avoiding that risk of the children and civilians using them. I have to say, though, you know, I don't think America will be doing this unless this is a really uncomfortable time for Ukraine. I mean, mines are generally for the defense rather than offense. If you're going on the offense, you don't want minefields littered around. You want to be able to charge at the enemy. If you're on the defense, you want to stop the enemy coming at you. Therefore, minefields slow you down. And I think if you look at the Kursk region, where the Ukrainians have got that enclave, Russia is determined to push them out before any form of potential negotiation. And if you could put a ring of steel, a ring of anti-personnel mines around their area, that would certainly slow up any Russian advance. Right. So it looks like that's where they're going to be used.
Right. But if just to take your time as an example, if they either set the timer or the batteries go dead after 40 hours, what's the point? Because, I mean, if you're going to put mines down, you're anticipating, you know, months of activity, not 2 days.
No, exactly right. And that's why this whole time issue of mines becomes so emotive. You know, when you put them down, do you really know when you want to lift them up again? Are they there for a distinct period of time? And that's why, you know, you've got this 1 to 40 hours. I think there's a lot talked about this. That's why I was really interested to talk about it on the podcast, because there's a military side. I can see the military utility of mines, but my goodness, if they are lasting a legacy, and because they're indiscriminate. You know, if you fire a bullet, if it's soldier versus soldier. Anti-personnel mines are indiscriminate. They don't care who you are, how old you are, what gender you are, how, you know, they will still wreak havoc with you. And therefore, it's really important that, you know, their use is limited and also is very well managed.
Yeah. So back to one of the first questions you raised by implication. So now we understand what they're for, how they're going to be used, how they deactivate. Why now?
Well, I think, as I say, I think it's because of this Kursk incursion. We raised the prospect: is this another last fling of the Biden administration. This particular one, I think, is so emotive. I don't think any administration want to have their legacy that they're actually handing over anti-personnel mines. I think this is just a really clear indication of how difficult life is for the Ukrainians. And we'll get onto it later, but there's a lot of conversations now that are clearly heading towards the potential for some form of negotiation. And therefore, if Ukraine can hold on to a little bit of Russian territory, that will be a negotiating chip in a form of negotiation. And therefore, anything that can be done to help Ukraine sustain that seems to be what the US is trying to do. And it seems to be why they've agreed to put ATACMS missiles. And that's also why the Storm Shadow missiles are also being used against targets in Russia in the Kursk region.
So, but if you talk about legacy and the current administration in the US not wanting the legacy, the funny thing about the media and media memory, and hence individual memory, is you can manage the way people remember things. So, yeah, you could argue that for the Biden administration to do it now, it would leave a legacy when kids get blown up, into the future, 2025 and beyond. But also you could argue that that legacy will be managed out and a new issue will come in, which is the then current administration having to deal with hundreds of kids being blown up. And that will make in the news, and the current administration will get the blame for it in some weird way. Sadly, that's the way the world of news works if you're not careful. So as you know, I'm slightly cynical about things like this at the moment. And given what you say about the termination of this war and where they've got to, it just seems the current administration should have been quiet in these 2 months and not doing things which are going to push things out of proportion suddenly and give the incoming team a bit of a problem. So I don't know. I'm not. I think the politics of this, there's a risk. The politics of this has actually got in the way and driven.
No, I don't disagree. I think for your first point, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Well, I think Churchill famously said, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." In other words, the victor tends to write history and therefore can capture it his own way. In terms of legacy, I think the whole US politics bit has been so animated, it's been so visceral that I don't think it's really reasonable when a war is going on for suddenly you have the election, right? Everything pauses, no decisions for the next 2 months, and then we start up again on the 20th of January. That discontinuity would not be helpful at all to anybody's interests around the world. The question is, how much do you do in that time to be dramatic? And I absolutely take that point. And as we've discussed before, I think there are a lot of voices in the US, saying that, it's just let Trump get in his hands on the reins and let him get on with it. Stop messing around.
Seen in my lifetime, which is the lame duck administration leaving the next administration with a world war, with a nuclear conflict, by allowing Ukraine, a proxy state of the United States, to strike within Russia. I think that people in Washington misunderstand Vladimir Putin, and they think he's a monarch with absolute power, which is not true. And Russian politics is complex and it's lively, and Putin is very concerned with his approval rating within Russia. He cannot appear weak. That's a huge threat to him. He feels that, I can confirm. If he can't hide attacks on him by the United States through Ukraine, either on Moscow or big civilian casualties, I think he will have no choice, in his view, but to launch like a serious response against Ukraine or NATO countries or possibly the United States. It seems like the most reckless thing that's ever happened in my life.
But I also think there is a war going on at the moment that isn't in America, it's in Ukraine, and it's happening thick and fast. And therefore, I don't buy into that nothing should happen for 2 months until the 20th of January. I think the world has an obligation to respond to Putin's actions, which is evidently pushing really hard at the moment, losing loads of people. You have to look at, why is he doing that? And the only logical explanation is because he sees an opportunity to negotiate potentially when the new administration comes in. Therefore, he's pushing harder now than he would have done. And therefore, should the West just sit back and let him do that, or should the West respond? And I think that's what the West is doing. But we're going to agree to disagree on this, because I don't disagree with the line that there is a political angle to this. I'm just not. I do think there is a military imperative at the moment, but I do take your point.
Okay, well, if one child, just one, anytime in the future steps on one of these mines and loses an ankle, there'll be trouble.
Yeah, and that's the tragedy of war, isn't it? I mean, as we speak today, Kyiv's been under missile attack from Russia. There are lots of innocent civilians, they're dying, and that's the willful act of people throwing missiles around. I think mines are incredibly emotive for all the reasons, and I just think it's a really difficult decision. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I don't see any political gain from this. Being strong, giving missiles, ATACMS, it plays more into the discussion we were having. Anti-personnel mines doesn't. I don't think any leader would want to be having that conversation. There's no upside to it politically. There's only downside. I think it's absolutely been driven by a very, very difficult situation on the ground, because I'm pretty sure that the legacy Biden would want would not be handing over anti-personnel mines.
Sean, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has said recently, again, we stand by Ukraine. And the UK has just allowed their Storm Shadow missiles to be used onto mainland Russia. So that's the first thing. The second is there are other things that have to go on for that to be effective, which might up the cooperation that's necessary within Ukraine with its allies.
Yeah, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of it in the last sort of 40 hours or so. Storm Shadow, let's be clear, it's a 30-year-old weapon. It's a cruise missile, subsonic, goes about 155 miles. So it's not quite as far as the ATACMS, but it still allows Ukraine to strike fairly deep into Russia if they needed to. Quite expensive. There's not many of them. And actually, Ukraine's been using these very successfully for over a year. Famously, there was the strike on the Russian naval headquarters at Sevastopol. You could easily identify the Storm Shadows going into that. At the time when they were given to Ukraine, I think Lord Cameron just went, as long as you're in law of armed conflict, use them as you like. Then the Americans got a bit nervous about the fact that using weapons on Russian territory, the Brits therefore rescinded that. Now, as a result of the Americans now making the decision that actually, yes, you can use ATACMS onto Russian soil as long as it's only around the Kursk region, then, it looks like the Brits have just gone, crack on to Zelensky, quick phone call, crack on. It doesn't look like Keir Starmer's going to make any sort of announcement on that. And I think that's probably smart, to be honest, because otherwise Putin just wails and suddenly throws more threats around. I think what's interesting from a purely military perspective is that Ukraine was invaded. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is pounding its energy infrastructure, its logistics hubs, its airfields, its railway yards. How can Ukraine hope to fight back unless it can do the same to Russia? And it's simply being given, buying, or securing weapons from the West to allow it to do that. And therefore, putting limitations on our weapons, I think, doesn't make sense. And of course, when you take those limitations off, as we're seeing, it gives right to President Putin hammering and wailing. Will the Storm Shadows change the game of this nature of the war? No, they won't. But there's just not enough of them.
So why do it then if they won't make a difference?
No, I mean, because we shouldn't be putting limitations on their use to President Zelensky.
Right. So I got two questions there. One is about timing. But before we get on to timing, can we deal with the other things that need to happen around a missile doing its effective job, which might require cooperation between us and other powers and Ukraine?
Yeah, so this is the bit where I think it gets a bit more sensitive. If you're Putin and you want some weapons and you want, in fact, you're Zelensky, so I'm America. Do you want an anti-tank weapon or a bullet or a round or an artillery shell? I give them to you and I walk away. You just use them. Things like a Storm Shadow, they go nearly a couple 100 miles. You can't see the target before you fire them. You haven't got many of them, so you need to make sure they're juicy targets. And also you need to be aware that you can't be killing civilians and stuff like that, because otherwise that will play badly and the countries that are giving you those weapons are not going to. So there's a whole load of intelligence, satellite technology intelligence that needs to be brought together. They are complex missions to plan. And what Russia alleges is that actually Americans and Brits are actually therefore involved in the planning process to help you use these weapons as they were so intended. Now, Ukraine, in a way, that decries the fact Ukraine is a fairly modern country. It does have access to a lot of this technology. And most of these weapons, I say, Storm Shadow is 30 years old. It's not that complicated. Let's not credit it with too much topsy. You don't need a whole load of boffins sat around a table and plugged into a supercomputer from America. It's not that complicated. But the allegation from Russia is, this is actually the West directly involved in targeting Russian soil, and that is why it suddenly starts to get inflamed. But as I said, the danger is all nuance. The reality is it's Russia that invaded Ukraine. It's not, this is part of a defense of a country.
Okay. One more question on that then, which is presumably when it hits its target, you need eyes on somewhere so you can actually capture a film. Those films make it onto the internet, on social media.
Yeah, I think most of the films, though, it's interesting when we were doing operations over Iraq or Afghanistan, because you had certainly total control of the air, you always had some aircraft with a video camera onto the target, so you could see whether it hit. You could do battle damage assessment, stuff like that. Of course, Ukraine doesn't have that. These missiles go deep towards enemy territory and then strike their target. Most of the videos that we're actually getting back are people's handheld cameras. I don't know if you saw last night, there were reports of these Storm Shadow strikes into the Kursk region, people capturing them on their mobile phones, whistling across. Will there be satellite technology that looks at the battle damage assessment? Yes. But most of those satellites, the best battle damage assessment you get is in the visual spectrum, cameras. What are we at this time of year? It's November. It's autumn, nearly winter. The weather is dreadful. There are very few clear blue days at the moment, so it's actually quite difficult to do an assessment of whether you've actually struck the target. Are there other ways of doing that? Yes, there are, but it is a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult when you don't have the dominance in the air and space that we would normally enjoy in most of our wars of choice over the last few years. So the battle damage assessment is a lot more difficult for Ukraine.
Okay. All right, on to the timing question. And this is probably the one that will stir me the most. And my concern here is there is a whiff of political sabotage going on between the outgoing administration in the US and the new one. I'd give the new guy a bit of a hard time to deal with. And from a UK point of view, we know there is massive alignment between the new Labour government in the UK and the Biden administration in the US. The Labour government sent at least 100 activists over to the US to help in the election, door knocking, doing PR work, all those sort of things. Flights were paid for, hotels were arranged. I mean, there's lots of, fun and games going on. Trump's not happy. So it seems to me that once the US had made their decision, which I think, there's a risk it smells. My view is maybe Keir Starmer just followed. What additional evidence is for that? Well, it's what you've said, which is, well, quite frankly, there's not many of them. They're very expensive. It's not going to make much difference. So if you're looking for a timing reason, my view is the bulk of the evidence sits down on the political motivation.
Yeah, and I say we'll agree to differ on this one. I've always tried to steer a little bit clear of the American politics. There's so after the election, there's been so much visceral hatred between the two parties, and that legacy continues. And you've got this slightly uncomfortable delay, which I'm not quite sure why, because the king is dead, long live the king. You've got President Biden is a lame duck now. He can't do anything, and yet President Trump has to wait until the 20th of January before he takes over. In our country, it's almost immediate, isn't it? You get moved out, moved in. You need continuity. That gap, I think, is really unhelpful, and it's unhelpful for so many reasons, and it leads to all of these sorts of conversations. For me, if there wasn't a clear military reason for doing it, I'd be more inclined to be critical. But there is so much chatter at the moment, even on channels that talking about Russia, even considering the option of negotiation, that it feels like the very success that the Trump approach so far seems to have been that there is the potential for talking, where for the last year, it hasn't felt like we've been even close to having the potential for negotiation. But of course, Putin is going into into negotiation like that in a position of relative strength. And one of the things that he will be determined to do is to maximize the strength of his position. And that will be, I don't want any Ukrainians on Russian territory when that happens. And evidence is that there are huge efforts, not only 50,000 Russian troops, but 12,000 North Korean troops being brought in. Just imagine that, to clear out those. And therefore, if you were trying to support Ukraine, not just on the battlefield, but also in preparation for whatever was happening negotiation-wise, you couldn't afford to wait till the 20th of January before actually offering help. And I think when this announcement was first made, it sounded like it was, yes, you can launch missiles anywhere across Russia. No, it's not. It's been very specifically around that Kursk region, and it's coherent with the conversation we've just had about anti-personnel mines. Do I think does it create a sort of undercurrent of discontent? Of course it does, but I suspect that's as much to do with the fact that they've got this horrible 2-month delay where it feels like America is a bit rudderless at the time, and the danger is that therefore is mischief making.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows?
Yeah, well, the airways have been absolutely heaving with it, this particular issue. Can we at least agree, Sean, that there is a bit of both sides in this, potentially, as much as, we can see sitting here. The tactical advantage that Ukraine gets that gives them a strategic card to play if and when there is a negotiation about how this thing is settled, versus the sort of political damage that might be being done by the current administration in the US, given Donald Trump coming in January. That there's a bit of something on both sides. It might be hard to.
Yeah, and again, both of us are old enough and ugly enough that this isn't a binary world. I'm not saying there's nothing of what you're saying in this, and at all. And I do think that there is a flavour of all of it. I just think it's probably been amplified by the fact that there's this delay. And of course, as you say, fundamentally, it appears that President Biden is the view that you can't allow Russia to win. It appears that Trump's view is that we can't allow the war to continue.
Yeah.
And I know those sound simple statements.
Good way of putting it, actually. I like that.
But
that's a tough one.
Philosophically, it's a different approach, isn't it?
Very different, yeah.
We have never been closer to World War III than we are today under Joe Biden. A global conflict between nuclear-armed powers would mean death and destruction on a scale unmatched in human history. It would be nuclear Armageddon.
Sean, you've been very, very busy on the airwaves over the last couple of days. You've been in huge demand. It seems to me you spent most of your time saying to people there's not going to be World War III driven by nuclear weapons. On the other hand, the media lapping up this issue, social media is lit up with it. Everybody is saying we are on the precipice potentially of a third world war. Can you sort of disentangle everything a bit for us?
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's been a very busy dawn till dusk chat, and my instinct with all of these things is that grey hair, been involved in the Cold War, most people haven't got that experience, and therefore, this alarmist, rhetoric is nothing more than that, and therefore, why would we worry? But I do recognise that not everybody is as old as knackered as you and I. That actually, a lot of people are genuinely worried about this, and I think one of the interviews I did yesterday captures this beautifully, where the interviewer, the line of questioning was all around the rhetoric of it is scaremongering, oh, this is dreadful, on the brink of World War III. Privately, that individual was also, their face was seeking reassurance that actually they wanted to hear that actually, no, we're not on the verge of World War III. And I think one of the reasons, there's so many aspects to this that I think we can explore. I am firmly of the view that nuclear weapons are abhorrent. Their very existence is abhorrent, but you can't uninvent them. And the whole concept of mutually assured destruction means that it is not in anybody's interest to press the button. The whole concept of it, if anybody's pressed the button, everybody dies. And therefore,
because everybody presses it.
Yeah, so there's no winners. And therefore, what it does do is it provides the ultimate protection for you, because why would anybody attack you when they know that you have the ultimate button to stop them? And that has served us well. What it hasn't served is the fact that now in a country who is a nuclear power can now bully another country who isn't a nuclear power. And if anybody tries to step in to stop them, they say, get involved and I'll nuke you. Now, but the same principle still applies. It's not in their benefit to nuke anybody. And the analogy I think it's a little bit trying to help people through this is it's a bit like a school bully. Do you in the schoolyard just keep out of the way of the school bully and you watch them picking on somebody and just leave them to it? Because actually, I don't want to get involved. I'll get hurt. It's not my fight. That sort of Putin-esque thing. But actually, that's all very well until you're the one being picked on by the bully. And then who's going to come and help you out? I don't know about you, but I was certainly had my fair share of bullying at school. I don't know about you, but, ultimately, the only way it was solved by somebody standing up to the bully.
Well, I had a bully at school. I didn't get bullied, but there was one guy actually a year below me who was an absolute bully, and people were scared of him. It took a guy a year older than me to deal with him. And literally 2 seconds into it, the bully was cowering in the corner by a guy who really was a bit weedier than him, a little bit older. And I thought, blimey, these bullies actually ultimately are weak inside. You just got to stand up to them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I know the stakes are a lot higher. I get all of that. But if you follow the logic of those people who think that they're worried about the threat of nuclear war, the corollary of that argument is that therefore you allow Putin to do whatever he wants because he's got nuclear weapons, he'll threaten us, and therefore we might write him a stiff letter, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. Now, there are some people who might think that's a clever idea. Let's follow that through. So that means then that when North Korea gets nuclear weapons and they decide to go rampaging around, are we going to let them just do whatever they like? Because they're going to threaten us the same way. They'll have learned the lesson. If China is going to then go into Taiwan and go into Africa, go into anywhere else, if Russia's going to go anywhere else, are we just going to stand back and let them happen? It writes a few stiff letters and say, no, somebody's got to stand up and actually be counted, because actually you've got to have the confidence to know that there is absolutely no way, any advantage whatsoever for anybody pressing that nuclear button. But what is happening very effectively at the moment is that President Putin is using it to scare the international community. And if you're talking about NATO, 32 countries, he knows that by mass, NATO is very powerful. Its weakness is it's a very loosely held together committee, and individual countries will not all feel the same way about this. And we're already seeing Hungary. We've got a clip actually of the Hungarian position, which is already softening even further towards President Putin.
Although the American people have decided, although it is a clear interest of the European people as well that peace should come back to Central Europe, but I think that the 2 months ahead of us, up to the 20th of January, are the 2 most dangerous months comparing the last couple of decades. Why? Because those who have carried out this failed pro-war strategy are not only not giving up, but they try to create a situation until the 20th of January where peacemaking will be extremely, extremely complicated. Their goal is definitely to make it impossible by the 20th of January to make peace.
And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this, because if the finishing line for this conflict is approaching, then your premise is that we're going to go back to doing business with Russia. The world will start to turn again.
Yeah. Well, so I've got, from a business point of view, which is where I've spent most of my life, I got some sort of strong opinions on that score. I do get the binary issue, which is if you leave a bully to go rampant, then you will, in the end, you suffer yourself because he comes after you. Allied with that is this thing about a bully comes along and steals your suit and then gives you back your trousers and everybody's happy. Yeah, but you still got my jacket. It's not fair. But there's a great likelihood that's going to be the outcome in Ukraine. And what we're going to have to do is sort of suck it up. But of course, if you suck it up, people will say, you'll take what you've said one step further. Say, well, you can never allow the guy to do that. You've got to stop him before it gets that far. Very difficult, isn't it? If you're actually in charge of the process. I'm a great believer in soft power. And soft power for me is two things. Firstly, it's diplomacy, which means you keep the communications open and you seek other ways and you make an assumption. Ultimately, both sides are keen to find a non-aggressive outcome. And secondly, you use all the other things you've just said. You use the sort of ultimate thing, which is all these big countries in the end want to trade. They want commercial relationships with other countries. And we can all foresee a time when we are going to be back on trading terms with some of the countries right now that we feel are aggressive enough to be called enemies.
Yeah, and that's the uncomfortable truth of this, is that wars do inevitably end. They might end because one side wins or one side loses, but they always end up with some form of negotiation. And that's a horrible compromise. And I'm convinced that the Ukraine war will end, and it might end sooner than we expect. It'll be a horrible compromise if it does. But I think that we're already seeing some countries position themselves that right at the start of the war, Russia's aggression, everybody scurries for cover, get under the NATO umbrella, hide as close as we can to America. We're going to be all right, bad guy Russia. As the war sort of potentially comes to an end, a lot of countries will want to be doing lucrative trade deals with Russia. Russia has a lot of oil. It has a lot of gas. There's a huge energy challenge in the world. And so individual countries, their memories may be fairly short, because as long as that war hasn't directly affected them, and I think we're already seeing that now. We're already seeing people sort of having a slightly softer view, because if they ingratiate themselves to Putin at this stage, they might be at the front of the queue when it comes to dishing out contracts again. And therefore, the unity of the Western world starts to crumble, and it starts to be who's left behind. Well, it might be America. Let's use that as an example. And therefore, Russia says, you see, this is always about America. It's not about everybody else. But again, it goes back to this nuclear question. It's very clear that President Putin does not want the West to be involved. If it was, Russia will be stopped in a heartbeat. And it's been very effective. And let's face it, what the slight irony here is that even Putin's own doctrine says that nuclear weapons are only really to be used if your own country is invaded. The ultimate defense. His country has been invaded for the first time since the Second World War, and he hasn't used nuclear weapons.
And that happened some time ago.
No, exactly. And I'm saying that's the right decision, but it simply exposes the fact that deterrence is as much about the threat than it is about the utility of it.
Yeah.
Even if it's nuclear, even if it's not nuclear, conventional weapons and warfare, the deterrence theory still applies, that you want to be scared of your enemy goes, I'm not sure I'm going to fare well here, because they're so well trained. They're stood on that wall. They look aggressive. They look mean. I'm not sure I'm going to win. That's all deterrence theory. And the nuclear is just another layer of that. And I think that what we're being challenged by a bit at the moment is that doomsday scenarios and pictures of nuclear weapons going off. I understand why that scares people. Do you remember? You must have been old enough to remember some of the public service films that went out that warned what to do in the event of a nuclear strike.
A warning may come quite unexpectedly. We will now tell you what to do if a warning sounds when you are at home. And then we will explain what to do if you are out of doors. First, if you are at home. If attack is imminent, you will hear the attack sound like this.
Yeah. Well, I was old enough to live through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was probably the last moment there was a real threat of global nuclear war. I was, just a teenager, and I remember being in the schoolyard, literally looking up into the sky for the planes that were going to come over and drop bombs on us. And that, it was completely wrong imagery in my head. And we were getting these films from the government about, what to do. Completely useless, by the way.
Hide under the table.
Yeah,
put a blanket over you to stop the fallout from hitting you.
All crazy things. I was scared.
But it's just a reminder to people today that these things, we lived through all that, but the principle was that everybody stepped back from the brink because there's nobody who benefits from nuclear war.
Behind the scenes, there was a conversation going on between two leaders.
Yeah, and also because at that stage, we went to DEFCON 5, DEFCON 4, DEFCON 3. They were actually matching nuclear weapons to warheads. They were actually getting airborne with aircraft. That was, holy shimoly, one wrong move now and we're in difficulty. Yeah. This isn't. This is Putin waffling about changing the doctrine because he knows he just has to say a few words. The front pages in the West are dominated by this. Everybody runs scared and he's allowed to continue with what he's doing. In principle, there's some powerful lessons we have to take from this. I don't think we're anywhere close to being in a nuclear exchange. What we are close to being is seeing the rise of confidence of people like Putin. And it's not just about him. If other nations see the power of the threatening behavior that he's using, North Korea, Iran, China, where does it stop?
Well, I'll tell you what's going on right now. What's going on right now is somebody in the US who's not a leading political figure is having a conversation with somebody in Russia who's not a major political, on the sort of TV political figure. And in Ukraine as well. These conversations go on without us realizing. So I'm sure that's happening. My hope, and I'm not blowing smoke up your nether regions, Sean, but I hope the guy in Russia and the guy in Ukraine, the guy in the UK and the guy in Washington in the US are as, calm and seasoned and basically analytical, and less given to, preposterous responses as you are.
And to be honest, Bern, that's exactly the reason why I get nervous when some of the picks for some of these positions of authority, it's up to the Americans who they choose, their Secretary of Defense and whatever. But you do need to have a measured, considered tone. You don't want people who fly off the handle suddenly. The stakes are just way too high for this sort of thing, and that's why diplomacy for many hundreds of years has served our nation well, because that's why the United Nations was formed. It was formed to create an opportunity for people to talk rather than fight. But as I say, at the moment, I think there's some profound lessons that are going to flow from this. And, and in meantime, I go off today from here. I'll doing another series of interviews with people who are understandably, very worried. But I honestly believe that is playing to Putin's agenda. It's not justified at all. And frankly, if nuclear war ever does come to this planet of ours, then it's the end of our time, and none of us will know much about it. So, it behooves all of us to do everything we can, but also within that context, we cannot let bullies rule the world, because if they do, then our future generations will not thank us.
More jaw, less war.
Love it.